The images on my time map in the left-hand corner where the mother is holding their child, sheltered from the rocks, and you could see the car with big shining lights coming up the gorge. This image was depicted by myself to represent, I suppose, the taking away of children from their parents, particularly the mothers, where some children were whisked away from their parents and taken to missions and reserves, government reserves, and placed in dormitories and different institutions. The image on the next to it, in the middle, with the womb, depicting a baby in the womb within a tree, symbolises the way in which, I suppose, birthing and the representation of birthing for our women in traditional society. It was basically a very soul act that women did by themselves with support from mothers and sisters, not too far off, but basically women were left alone to be able to bring their children into the world by themselves. And this was a way in which I suppose there was a breathing in of spirit, a spiritual strength to the child, and the bonding of the child and the mother together. Our dreaming, the painting directly under it with a poem, we are, after all, a point of existence on the continuum of life, explains, I suppose, that our life is cycle. It's like a big circle. We come into this world through our parents. We go out of this world, and we continually live in this world through our children and our children's children. It's the continuation, I guess, of humanness to our stories of the land. The lady with the coolamon on the very right-hand side that I'm facing, the image with the woman holding a basket over her head while she's got a coolamon scooping up the water, is the way in which, I guess, our women prepared their food in our traditional society. They were the main food gatherers for each First Nations groups. The men, of course, went out on elaborate hunting parties, but to be able to sustain the whole First Nation group with food, everyone was dependent on what the woman was able to bring together for each of the families in the way in which they gathered their food off the lands through the waterways and off the flora and fauna. Different types of plants were edible that were gathered together. And I guess it was because of the woman that there was certainty that everyone would not go hungry. The picture under the woman grasping her child on the left-hand side of the screen depicts a small family, an elderly man with his wife and their child. You can see the number of people in the background. This depicts the stories of the great roundups from before 1901, direction by the federal government that all states and territories would be responsible for taking away First Nations off their lands. It was the final act, I suppose, acknowledging an empty country, an empty continent, which was not the truth at all. When you consider that there's over 250 First Nations who have continued to occupy this continent for thousands of millenniums past, to the recent 250 years or so of non-First Nations invasion and settlement on this continent, now called Australia. The paintings beside it, going towards the middle, depict the constant way in which First Nations, when they were rounded up and placed on missions and reserves, were herded by foot or herded into missions and reserves by trucks that were constant convoys into missions such as Cherbourg, the place where I grew up. And you can see the stop sign underneath, directly underneath the woman classing the child, where everywhere you went, because you were an inmate of each mission, you were under the legislated conditions of prisoners, Her Majesty's prisons. And you could see that there's an old gentleman asking the supervisor or the superintendent at that particular point in time for permission to receive a permit. You can see the permit is outlined underneath. That's my own personal permit that I carried around with me for years and years, that you had to present to every police officer or government officer on any journey that you undertook. It was an order of the legislation of the Australian Constitution that made everything possible before things changed after the 1967 referendum, where people were managed by states and territories. Under the title of hope, I guess, there's always hope in everything of our histories, regardless of what predicaments and what treatments anyone goes through. The humanness of hope allows us to be provided with strength in order to endure quite a lot of the hardships and the lack of understanding, I guess, of being controlled by the acts that governed our lives. Particularly for me as a child, I grew up into the dormitory systems, where for me, in order to even be with family who lived in the camp areas on the mission of Cherbourg, I had to line up along with the girls in the girls' dormitories and receive a permit from the matron that allowed me to be absent and visiting families up in the camp areas. If we went to an event in town, and we did go to some, I was fortunate to be able to join the Girl Guides. And in order for us to attend the Girl Guides meetings on a Saturday afternoon, in our shiny, our blues and our shiny badges and our shiny shoes, we were driven by the Sergeant of Police just in case, I suppose, as a precaution, in case we decided to abscond the mission. With such a blanket like that over your heads, it makes you wonder really about the injustices. It makes you wonder whether or not there is really, truly a hope for our futures. And that's being said, as a First Nation student, undertaking research towards my doctorate, my PhD, I wanted to be able to ensure that the research that I undertook validated most of those things that I actually experienced as a child. And sure enough, the legislation was very, very clear. If you've got a chance to be able to read one of my books, for instance, you'll be able to see that that's true.